Jangan lupa
Selamat
kok,
siang.
guys.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We are from Group 4, want to discuss about reestablishment of English language, history of English language. So before we start, we want to introduce ourselves first. First is me, Fausrido, and my friends are Eri Ilham Maulana, Akrom Irfandi, Kinanti Larasati, and Renaldi Andriyal. So let's begin for the first material explained by Kinanti Larasati. Time is yours.
Okay, thank you, guys. The linguistic situation did not continue because of the condition under which, after 1200, England lost a significant part of its possession in Europe. The growing rivalry between England and France culminated in the Hundred Years' War, which affected the social, economic, and part of the English language. In the 14th century, English was again spoken throughout England, and and in the 15th, France disappeared from the British Isles. This change in condition occurs as a result of a. The loss of Normandy. Normandy became the chain linking England to France, but it was broken in 100 to 1204 when King John lost Normandy after a French court confiscated his territory. The loss of Normandy was advantageous for England, and England as the king and his nobles looked upon England as their first concern. B. The separation of the French and English nobility. After the Norman conquest, large numbers of people controlled land in England and France. In 1204, the process of succession was accelerated when the King of France confiscated and land of several great barons and all the knights living in England. After 1250, there was no reason for English aristocrats to think of themselves as anything other than English. C. France ran for Siemens lost their European connection and experienced a new invasion of for, foreigners that begins during the reign of King John, whose wife is friend Henry Johnson's son was entirely friend in his taste and connection. 10 years later, when Henry's mother, after the death of his father, King John, married a Frenchman and foreign marriage was encouraged by the king and queen of the time. D. Reaction to foreigners and the growth of nationality. That the entry of foreigners is not entirely detrimental to the English language. Even during John's reign, the, there were there were calls for a British for England policy. Uh, A. E. The revival of French culture in Europe. In, a, in addition, to stimulus provided for the use of French in England. It had wide popularity throughout Europe in the 13th century, and French development in England continued into 18th century. Italian Brunetto Latini dance master wrote his work, the Great Encyclopedia Literature Sirsa 12 Sirsa 1 1265 in French because speech in the most delicious and the most common to everyone. Thank you.
So we move to the next materials explained by Eri Ilham Maulana. Time is
Okay,
yours.
okay, thank you, Fawas. In this material, we're gonna talk about the status of English and French in the 13th century. Okay, the 13th century witnessed a shifting emphasis upon English and French in England. The upper classes continued to speak French not as a mother tongue inherited from Norman ancestors, but rather as a language supported by social custom and by business and administrative convention. At the same time, English made steady progress, and by the middle of the century, it became generally used by upper classes. And by the end of the century, some children of the mobility spoke English as their mother tongue and had to be taught French stock manual provided with English glosses. To have complete picture of status of English and French in England during the 13th century, we have to deal with some of the factors to ended to be favorable or otherwise for each of the two languages. These factors are dealt with in subsection A and B below with their division. A. Factor affecting the status of French. There were three factors to have their effect upon the status of French in England during the 13th century. These were the attempt to slow the decline of French, the provincial character of the French language spoken in England, and the Hundred Years' War. Following is a brief discussion of these three factors. Factor 1, attempt to slow the decline of French, is the last decade of the, wait a second, okay, sorry, attempt to slow the decline of France. It's the last decade of 13th century and course of the 14th, the French language was losing a hold on England. Evidence for his fact is seen in the measures adopted to keep it in use, especially when the tendency to speak English becomes stronger in the two most conservative institutions, namely the church and the universities. Of 14th century, states of Oxford University required the student to translate in both an English, French, lest the French language be entirely suit the foundation state of Queen's College 113-14. Okay, record that conversation the students be in Latin or in French. At Cambridge College expect the student to speak English rarely. After Latin and French, similar regulations were also found necessary in the church. Okay, 2. The provincial character of French in English. One factor against the continent of French in England was a fact to Anglo-French was not a good French. The French is introduced into England was predominantly Norman, but under influence, English linguistic tendencies is gradually developed into something different from any of the dialects spoken in French. Before long, the French of England, there was mail from European speakers and become the subject humorous treatment in literature. Okay, 3. The Hundred Years' War. In the contrast following the Norman conquest, the connection of England with the continent was broken. This was followed by conflict in interest and increasing feeling of animosity that reaches the highest point in a long period of hostility between England and France 1030-37 and 1040-53. A major cause was the interference of France in England's attempt to control Scotland. King Edward III finally put forth a claim to be French throne and invaded England. Also, this long war turned people's attention to be concerned once more, and the expedition might have tended to keep a French language in use. It had no such effect, but rather led to an opposite consequence. B. Factor of the status of English. An important factor in helping English recover its former prestige was the rapid improvement in the condition of the laboring class and the rise of considerable middle class during the latter part of the Middle English period. These changes were greatly accelerated when in 148 there appeared in England and quite contagious and fatal disease that spread rapidly all over the country, reaching its height in the following year and continuing into the early month of 1013 The mortality was incredibly high, approximating 30%. This high mortality rate is quite sufficient to justify the name of the Black Death. As in most epidemics, the rich suffered less than the poor. In the sense, the mortality was greatest among the latter. The result was a serious shortage of labor and the immediate rise wage. The effect of the Black Death thus includes the economic incompetence of the laboring class, and as the result, the importance of the English language which they spoke. At this time, there's also another important group, namely the craftsmen and the merchant class, who stood halfway between a rural peasant and hereditary aristocrats.
Okay, we move to the next material explained by Renaldi Anduyao. The time is yours.
The status of English and French in 14th century. As we have done in section 2 above, we are going to examine the position of both English and French in England. But this time, in the 14th century, unlike what we did in section 2, the present section purports to deal with English first and with French second. This is because English in this century regained its status as the language of all the English people. Factors affecting the status in 14th century. A. French. Although everyone understood English, this does not mean that French had entirely gone out of use. It was still sometimes used at the court, although English had replaced it. French was simply the language of two groups, the educated class and the French. First, increasing ignorance of French in the 14th and 15th century. In the above, we have mentioned that there were many nobles who could not speak French in the beginning of the 14th century. This condition became more prevalent as time went on. By the 15th century, the ability to speak French fluently was looked upon as an accomplishment, and the ability to write it became less general among people of profession. 2. The rise of French as a language of culture and fashion. When French went out of use as the spoken language in England, its share became more restricted, and the reasons for cultivating it changed. French started to be learned to enable Englishmen to communicate with their neighbors in French, not to communicate among themselves as before. And B. English. The subsection includes 3 points, namely the general adoption of English over England, the employment of English in the law courts, and the use of the English language in the school. The first is the general adoption of English. At the beginning of the 14th century, everyone in England knew English. until a generation or two before that time so much of the polite literature of England had been in French. When writers used English, they felt forced even to justify their decision. They frequently did distinct prologue and incidentally led interesting expression on the linguistic certificate. And the second is English in the law courts. Soon after the Norman conquest, French was the language of all legal proceedings. But in 1356, proceedings in the courts of London of Middlesex were ordered English, to be in English. And in 1362, the Statute of Reading was enacted in the Parliament and was to go into effect into the following year. According to this statute, all lawsuits were to be conducted in English because French is much unknown in the said island in England. Although the statute was not fully approved and once it constituted the official recognition of English in the law court. And the last is English in the schools. Shortly after the contest, sorry, shortly after the conquest, French replaced English as the medium of instruction in the schools. In the 20th century, there were complaints that formal education was introduced but was now in French because other people now teach on floor. Okay, that's all for me. And the next by explained by Akram. Akram, time is yours.
Okay. And for the fourth material, English in writing. The last step in the gradual action of the English language was its employment in writing. This is because in this respect it had to compete with both Latin and French. French was the first language in England to break the monopoly of Latin in writing. It was only in the 15th century that English succeeded in replacing both. About 1350, French was at its height as the language of the private and semi-official correspondence. The earliest letter written in English appear in the later part of the 14th century, although there were few before 1400. Eventually, after 1450, English letters were used everywhere. The situation was rather similar with Wales. The earliest known English will after the conquest dates from 1383, but will written in English were rare before 1400. In 1308, sorry, in 1897, the Earl of Kent made his will in English, and in 1400 and sorry, in 1438, the Countess of Stanford did likewise. The wills of Henry IV, Henry V, and Henry VI were all written in the English language. In the 15th century, English was adopted for the record of towns and guilds, as well as in some branches of the central government. About 1430, some towns translate their ordinance and books of custom into English. English became generally used in their transaction after 1450. It was likewise with the guilds, in some of which English was used along with French in their ordinance. This was the case in a London guild as early as 1345 and later at York in 1400. The record of Parliament are a similar case. The petition of the commons on which statutes were based if they were approved were usually in France until 1423. These petitions were enrolled in French even when they had been originally printed in English. As for the statutes themselves, they were generally in Latin until about 1300, then in France until the reign of Henry VII. It was in 1485 that they began to appear in English, side by side with French, until French entirely disappeared in 1489, the reign of Henry V. In 1413 until 1422 marked the turning point in the use of English in writing. The king set an example in using English in his correspondence and exerted certain efforts in promote its use in writing. Apparently, his victories over the French gave the English a pride. King Henry V in the beginning of the next marked the period at which English began to be sorry at which English began to be generally adopted in writing. The year 1425 is open that of the general employment of the English language in writing. Maybe that's all for me, and the next material will be explained by Thomas Rudy.
All right, for the next material explained by me. So, the Middle English literature. The literature written in England during the Middle English period reflect the changing condition of the English language. When the French was the language best understood by the upper classes, the book they read were in French. The literature in English that has come down as from 1150 to 1250 was almost exclusively religious or admonitory in nature. Interpretation of gospel passage and story science life. So, however, there are some exception of work that did not deal with the religion subjects. The astonishing first debate between the owl and the nightingale. About the years 1195, the 100 years between 1150 and 1250 were just called the period of religious record. The absence of work in English appealing the courtly taste marked the English language at this time the language of the middle and lower classes. In addition to written literature, there was also a body of popular literature that circulated orally among the people. But such a literature left only slight trace of early period. The separation of the English nobility from France also around the year in 1250 at the spread of the English among the upper class is reflected in the next 100 years of English literature. Polite literature that had until the time appeared only in the France now appeared in English. The most popular type of this literature was the Romance. Only one English Romance exists from an earlier date that come from 1250, but from this time on, translation and adaptation from France begin to appear, and their number increased largely during the 14th century. Although the religion literature and their number increased during the 14th century, the 100 years between 1250 and 1350 is labeled the period of religious and secular literature in English literature. This period indicates clearly the wider spread of the English language, the generally employment of English albeit case, which took place by the latter half of the 14th century. To this period belong the William Langland, John Wycliffe, and other post-writer and poetry who made the latter part of the 14th century an outstanding period in Middle English literature. The 15th century is something called the imitative period because so much of the poetry written at this time imitating of the Chaucer. The same century is something also referred to as the transition period because it covers a large part of time between the age of Chaucer and that of the Shakespeare. To this period belong to writers Lydgate, Hawcliffe, Skelton, and House. At the end of the century, English literature had the prose of Mallory and Caxton, Scottish imitator of the Chaucer, e.g. Henryson, Dunbar, Gawain, significant work. This author carried the tradition of English and literary medium into the Renaissance. Thus, English literature during the Middle English period sets interesting light on the status of the English language. Okay, guys, I think that is all from our materials about re-establishment from the history of English language. So thank you for your attention. We close our discussion. So happy good day and thank you.